So we're on chapter 25 of your world history book, and we're going to be talking about the European theater in 1942 and 1945 of World War II. So we just did the last video on how the United States entered World War II after we were bombed by Japanese at Pearl Harbor. So let's begin. We're going to start with the Battle for Africa in the Mediterranean. And why the Battle of Africa? Because the Germans wanted control of the Suez Canal. The English had control of the Suez Canal for quite a while, and for Egypt. So basically, Hitler wanted that control so he can control all the ships that would have to go through that canal. If the canal was blocked by the Germans, then most ships, whether they're American or European ships, would have to go all the way around Africa and thousands of extra miles before they could get to the east. So that canal was very important. And it was very important to both the British and to the Germans, because the Germans had control. They could control the ships that were going into the east. So the battle for Africa and the Mediterranean, well, it was bleak in 1942 for the Allies. Who were the Allies? The United States, England, France, Canada, Australia. It's pretty bleak. The Germans had a foothold. Then after the United States entered the war, the German submarines infested the Atlantic Ocean. So the submarines were all over. So basically, they sank more than 6,266,000 tons of vital war materials that were sent into Europe by America. So we were sending all of these food and supplies and materials and ammunition to Europe, to England. And of course, the Germans, submarines, would want to sink those ships of supplies, which they did. And in the summer of 1942, the British Canadian force, we're thinking of Canada now, attempted a raid at the French port of Dieppe, and they brutally were repulsed by the Germans, which means the Germans took them easily. So then the Germans Hitler and the thinking, oh, this is going to be very easy to overcome Canada and America. They're very weak, thinking we were very weak, which they didn't know. They had just, Japan had just awakened a sleeping giant, right? The Germans launched their own offenses in the summer of 1942 to seize the Caucasus and the Suez Canal. So the Germans now wanted that canal, that Suez Canal that was in Africa, that would block Allied ships from coming into the east. El Alamein with General Montgomery. General Montgomery is a British general there, and he'll be fighting against the Desert Fox, which was Rommel and his African Corps. So the Allies had to act fast to save Egypt and North Africa, save the Suez Canal. So Rommel, the German general, Rommel's African Corps had driven the British deep into Egypt, and they were only 65 miles away from Alexandria in the Nile Delta. They're very close to the Nile. And Alexandria, being that beautiful African city, now was very close to being bombed and taken over by the Germans. So in the fall of 1942, the British 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery launched a heavy counteroffensive against the African Corps at El Alamein. So here comes Montgomery. He's fighting against the German aggressor of Rommel. There were 59,000 casualties on the German side. So this forced the Germans back, and they did not take Alexandria. So General Montgomery had great success at this point. You see him This is fighting in the desert. Can you imagine that? On to what they called Operation Torch, was American operation, with General Eisenhower and General Patton. On November 1942, the Allies launched this Operation Torch, which was an invasion of the French Northwest Africa. So basically, Germany had taken over France and onto the French African colonies now. So let's talk about who these generals were, because you're going to have to know them. Very important in the midst of fighting in Europe. Dwight D. Eisenhower. He actually later became a president of the United States. Let's picture him right here. And then George S. Patton, right? Patton. And he too, a very famous general. And then, of course, we have the other picture there being Montgomery, the British general at this point. So the Anglo-American forces landed at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. So the Axis, which were the Germans, right, dominated the French forces and surrendered. The French forces ended up surrendering in 1 week. So Montgomery's forces were pushing west, and Eisenhower's First Army was driving east. And the Afrika Korps got caught right in the middle between Montgomery and Eisenhower. So, and the Nazis were forced to surrender. So the Nazis surrendered in Africa, which was a great, a great thing for the Allies, I should say. A great accomplishment, let's say, or, being able to conquer the Nazis at this point. So in Tunisia, in May of 1943, Africa was totally secured now by the Allies, and the German forces were driven out of Africa. The conquest of Sicily. So when we talk of Sicily, we're talking Italy, right? So we're going to be talking about the Italian forces. And who is the leader of the Italian forces? Mussolini, a dictator, a vile dictator, in fact. So let's see what's happening in Italy now. The small German and Italian forces on Sicily were unprepared for the complete Allied invasion and were quickly overwhelmed by the combined forces of General Patton and General Montgomery. Two American generals went in there to Sicily, on into Italy to overcome the dictator Mussolini. So there were 100,000 Axis troops there. Axis means German and Italian troops, Hitler's and Mussolini's troops. And they had been evacuated to the mainland prior to attack. So the Italians now feared war in their own homeland. They said, oh no, we are going to be attacked. So they actually mutinied against Mussolini, and they forced Mussolini and his government to resign on July 25th. So the Italians are forcing their own dictator out, right? So Mussolini was arrested by the Italian officials, but was then rescued later on by Hitler. If you go on and investigate Mussolini, he actually was executed by his own Italian government later on. So we have Mussolini being set just as a puppet, and so now we know who's in charge. Mussolini's not in charge anymore. Hitler is. So he was installed as this powerless puppet in this regime in North Italy. And then Italy surrendered to the Allies. So Italy surrenders to England and to America, to the Allies forces on September 18, 1943, and turned against those German Axis powers. So now Hitler is free of control by Mussolini, and Italy is free of control by Mussolini and Hitler too. So Hitler's joining the other, Italy is joining the other side. Now, hope I didn't confuse you. Look at this picture of this pulling this little dog. This is the fighting going on in Italy. The Italian campaign now. The Germans in Italy, they refused to leave Italy and turned the whole country into a battleground. They knew Britain's plans under Churchill to invade Hitler through the soft underbelly of the Axis. So they knew, the Germans knew, okay, basically the Americans and Britons are going to come in and attack because there's in Italy, basically the Italian government is not even in support of Hitler. So the British 8th Army and the American 5th Army made a final attempt to capture the city of Rome in Italy in May. So they went in and captured Rome. The Allied forces pierced the German lines and entered Rome triumphantly on June 4th, 1944. A great triumph for the Allied forces coming in and taking over Rome, the main city in Italy. The German forces held out through fall and winter of 1944. The German forces still were there, even though they were being defeated on some of these fronts. Finally, in April 1945, the war was over in Italy in 1945. We'll find the war starting in Europe, starting to end during that year. So let's go on. The disaster in Russia, the last German offensive. So you remember how the Germans are going into Russia now. Russia now is an allied nation fighting against Hitler, as Hitler thought he could go in and take over Russia, which didn't work. So now there was savage fighting between 1942 and 1945 between the Nazis and the Soviet Russians on the Eastern Front. So the Russians, the Soviets, I call them Soviets at that time because they were under communism of Stalin. So you have Hitler and Stalin's forces fighting against each other. So Hitler planned one final campaign to conquer the Soviet Union. Remember, the Soviet Union is Russia, communist Russia. In May 1942, the armies struck and captured the Crimean area and pushed into the Caucasian area, which both are parts of Russia. And that they wanted to seize the vital oil fields. So in October 1942, the Nazis under Hitler were stopped at the city of Stalingrad. The Russians surrounded the German 6th Army and pinned the Germans in to the city for 2 months. Hitler ordered his troops to fight to the last man, but they were frostbitten. They didn't have winter clothes. They were hungry. They were weary. The Germans were practically in all of that, they were defeated, so they were forced to surrender. So Germany surrenders to the Russian offense. Germany surrenders to the Soviet Union under Stalin. So we see the problem there that has been in the past and all these past wars that as for fighting in Russia, you find they have the coldest winters, and when it rains, there's so much mud, and of course tanks and armies cannot even get through some of the mud. So they basically have to be beware of the harshness of the climate in Russia that defeats many armies. The Russian juggernaut. So now the Russians are on the offense. They are going to drive these Germans out of their country. The Soviets now began to drive the battered Germans back. By the end of 1944, the Russians had recaptured all of their territory and stormed into the Eastern Europe, occupying now Finland, the Baltics, Romania, Bulgaria, and Poland. So you can see here, here's the area, here's the map, where on this side is the Soviet Union, Russia, under the communism at that time of Stalin. But they were driving, as you see these lines and arrows, they're driving the German army under the Nazis out of Russia and out of Hungary into Poland, these areas, driving them back into Germany, right? As the year closed, the huge Soviet armies were poised to plunge into Central Europe and capture Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and even Germany. So the Russians went in from the east, capturing Hungary, which was under Nazi control, and Czechoslovakia, which Hitler was one of the first areas that he conquered, right? And now even the Soviets were going into Germany and attacking Germany and Hitler's Nazis even their home country. So the beginning of the end we call D-Day. D-Day was a fantastic victory for the Allies. And especially when we say D-Day, we just smile as Americans, knowing because we know as Americans, we came in and basically, brought victory and hope into Europe. So D-Day is June 6, 1944. And it was at Normandy, which is northern France. While the Allied forces engaged the Nazis on the Italian and Eastern fronts, we talked about Italy and Russia, now the greatest armada the world has ever seen was being assembled in southern England along the English Channel. So along the English Channel, Americans were coming in. We were bringing our soldiers into England to fight this war. Huge amounts of troops came in, and lots of weapons were supplied, and the ships had been sent from America to England. General Eisenhower was chosen as the supreme Allied commander of this magnificent day, D-Day, this invasion. But on June 6th, 1944, D-Day, thousands of Americans, British and Canadians, and Free French troops hit the beaches of Normandy in northern France. The Allies were going to take France back. Remember, France had fallen to Hitler and to Germany, right? So they were under the Nazi control. So basically D-Day was the day that we were going to take back, the Allied forces taking back France. So this was the largest amphibious, which means seaborne, assault in the history of the world. You see all these soldiers coming in to take back France from Germany, from German control, from the Nazis, from the Axis control. Recovering France from Nazi control. Shiploads of Allied troops crossed the English Channel into France. Planes and gliders carried more troops deeper into France. So after securing the beach at Normandy, the Allies broke through the German lines and raced across France, led by American General Omar Bradley's First Army and General Patton's Third Army. So here we have pictures there of Patton and Omar Bradley as generals, of American generals coming in to France to help the French to get loosed of the bondages of Nazis. So the second invasion along the southern coast of France enabled Free French forces to liberate Paris. They set Paris free. On August 24th, 1944, Paris was free. Within a few weeks, over 1 million Allied soldiers were fighting in Western Europe, liberating or freeing France, and also freeing the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands too, in Luxembourg. So you can imagine these people there just under the terrorism of the Nazis, now knowing that they were going to be set free. As America, we came to save the day indeed in those countries. The U.S. Army Air Corps, the 332nd Fighters, were a special Air Force group, Army Air Corps. And they were nicknamed the Fighting Red Tails. And this unit comprised of talented Black American pilots. They achieved complete superiority in the air and supported the Allied advance on the ground. The German remnants retreated to the Siegfried Line in Germany. They drove back Germans. So such amazing for these fighters, and they were all Black men from America that had come, and truly courageous group of the Fighting Red Tails. Hitler's officers mutiny. Oh wow. So Hitler's officers were thinking, what is he doing now? And they were afraid they're going to lose here. So several German officers decided that Hitler was a lunatic, that he was crazy. He wanted to control the whole world. And so they accused him of driving the German people to ruin, that Hitler would keep going and keep saying, basically keep fighting and have his people fighting and fighting to the end until they were totally ruined. So some of the generals mutiny. Some felt for Germany's sake Hitler should be assassinated. This would leave the military free to negotiate peace. The generals wanted peace now. They didn't want to follow Hitler anymore. On July 20th, 1944, a group of officers exploded a bomb during a conference that Hitler was attending. Now, there's a movie on this, if you watch, with Tom Cruise that shows how this happened, and it's pretty accurate. But the bomb failed to kill Hitler. So Hitler was so enraged that his own generals had tried to kill him that Hitler ordered the execution of anyone suspected of any disloyalty to him, the Der Führer. Even the great scientist Max Planck, his son, was involved, and even the renowned Erwin Rommel, remember here, the Desert Fox? He was forced to commit suicide. One of his greatest generals in Africa had turned against him and had to commit suicide, forced to commit suicide. So the generals were being persecuted as well. The German war effort deteriorated as Hitler and his generals began to distrust and dislike each other. So his generals did not like him anymore. And that's really what's going to cause the downfall of Germany. While this was all going on, the Battle of the Bulge. Now, my father-in-law, Papa Perry's dad, was in this battle. He actually got wounded in this battle, and so we know quite a bit about it. But anyway, the Battle of the Bulge was the Nazis' last offensive in the West. On December 1944, Hitler launched a counterattack through the dense Ardennes, or I would say Ardennes, forest in Luxembourg and Belgium. There were only four, at this time, in the Ardennes, there were only four weakened American divisions that were recovering there. So this is actually a monument here because they were so weak and the Germans were attacking, not knowing, and this again being a surprise attack. And the Americans had also been fighting, for all these weeks. So they were very tired. So on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the German armies struck those weakened divisions along a 90-mile front in the Ardennes. And so after the initial success, the Nazis were confined to this narrow bulge area. And the heroic stand of the American units, although they were tired, they fought very courageously. Then the 101st Airborne Division at Bastion, Belgium, valiantly defended them. So on January 1945, the German army was again forced to retreat. So the Battle of the Bulge, being a tired American army that fought so courageously in that moment, became victorious as the Airborne Division came and saved them. So we have this great battle called the Battle of the Bulge. The fall of the Third Reich. Remember, that's what Hitler called the Third Reich, that he was going to take over the world. He was going to be the third, be that great ruler, one world government. Remember, the Third Reich. On March 1945, the Soviets had invaded Eastern Germany and were just 60 miles from Berlin. So the Soviets, they are coming from the east, only 60 miles from the capital of Germany. The Allied forces in the west, so they're coming in from the west too, had forced the Nazis to retreat behind the Rhine River, Germany's last defense barrier. An American controlled discovered that there was an intact bridge across the Rhine River. So they quickly went across this river that was really guarding, the German front, but they had found this place to cross, and they established a powerful hold on the east bank of the Rhine River. By April, American and Russian troops linked together from each side, making the fall of Hitler's Third Reich imminent, knowing that now Germany indeed was going to have to surrender. Germany was caught between the East, the Russians in the East, and the Americans and the British and the French in the West, along with Canadian and Australian troops too on that side, and was quickly overrun. Victory in Europe, May 8th, 1945. Hitler, what happened to Hitler? He ran and retreated to this underground bunker. And in that, on April 30th, 1945, he committed suicide with his mistress there. And Berlin surrendered on May 2nd. The Germans surrendered unconditionally on May 7th. So the next day, May 8th, 1945, was declared VED Day, which means Victory in Europe. And indeed, there was great celebration, as you see as these pictures, all over the world, celebrating that now Hitler was gone, and basically the war had been won by the Allies, and they were so ecstatically happy, even though they had lost many soldiers, especially in Europe. But now they could look to the hope of the future. We're not going to be attacked by this dictator, this despot that wanted to rule the world. So, victory in Europe.